So these are my biggest questions for the national championship game, Ohio State versus Alabama. Let's get into it. First off, I want to know what's carried over for Ohio State. A lot of folks in Buckeye Nation who watched the regular season, you know that you just peaked at the right time against Clemson. You actually did against the Tigers what they normally do to other teams. Well, you turned that trick on them, and it was beautiful to watch if you're not a Clemson Tiger fan. So what carries over from that game? You know, I've seen time and time again teams that'll play loose in the regular season, or maybe loose in one particular setting because you have that kind of back against the wall, nothing to lose mentality. Well, then all of a sudden you win, and it takes a little while, but then all of a sudden it sets in, like the gravity of the situation makes itself apparent. And all of a sudden, you're aggravated because you're watching that team the following week in the regular season, or maybe you're watching them in a bowl setting or in a championship setting, and you're saying, wait a second, why are we so tight in this game? Man, we were so loose. Remember that other game? We were so loose. Why are we so tight here? So that's the biggest skill. That's the biggest coaching point for Ryan Day. And I'm certainly not telling him anything he doesn't already know, and I don't think he's watching the show tonight, so it's irrelevant. That's the biggest key here. If he does nothing more then bottles up what they had against Clemson from an intangible standpoint and opens that jar up and pours it onto the field Monday night in Miami. If he only does that, then the rest should take care of itself. Because there's something that we've talked about with Ohio State. It's called being in ascension mode. Again, I've referenced Clemson in the past as having done that. Clemson has had a season, for instance, like the one in 2016, where they lost a regular season game. They had several more close one-possession type squeakers, but yet if you watched them play Alabama in the national championship that year, you would look at that team and say, man, if that team had played in the regular season, they would have won every game by 50. Like, what's the deal here? Well, that's called ascension mode. That's a team that all of a sudden starts to rapidly climb at the right time. Ohio State, we only have a one-game sample size, so we don't know if that's what's happening here or if we had a perfect storm present itself in the semifinal game. But if they are in ascension mode, and you'll know early on, teams don't come out flat in ascension mode, I can assure you of that. So we'll know it early on. And if they are, forget about a point spread, forget about what records have said this year, how many games you played and how many games they played. All that stuff's out the window. You're going to have a four-quarter knife fight. So what has carried over for Ohio State from last game to this game? Second question, what are we going to get out of guys like Jalen Waddle and LaBryan Ray for Alabama? LaBryan Ray, I'll go in reverse here. LaBryan Ray, Alabama fans know who he is, but he's been a guy that's had several injuries throughout his career. You know, he is a guy that Nick Saban earlier this season called one of their most irreplaceable assets defensively. Well, they lost him to a kind of a weird injury. It's like no one really knew what happened to him. And so he is practicing and looks to be able to play on Monday night. I don't know how much he's going to be able to play, but I'll be really interested because, hey, that's a really good defensive piece. And it's important to note he didn't have a lower extremity injury. So it's not a guy coming back from a knee injury or something like that. And so his wheels should be good. I don't know what kind of shape cardiovascular-wise he'll be in. Like, I don't know what kind of pitch count they may have him on, but he could make a difference there. Jalen Waddle is a guy who had a lower extremity injury. And it's been sort of a running joke around the Alabama program for about a month and a half or 2 months now of when is he going to come back? Are they gearing him up? Do they have a big Sharpie circle in red on a calendar that's the national championship game? Are they just making sure that he rehabs on a trajectory that will get him back for that game? Well, I mean, if I had to place money, I'd say Jalen Waddle is going to be on the field in some capacity Monday night. Now, I think what we're all waiting to see is, I mean, is he out there as some kind of decoy? I know that's kind of been a popular talking point over the past week leading up to the game. Or, I mean, are they going to go to him first play of the game? Are they going to hit him on a smoke screen or maybe quick slant over the middle? Jalen Waddle 27 yards after the catch, and then all of a sudden, you know, he pops up, gives the first down signal, and you go, he's back. He's a little more back than I thought he'd be. So that's just kind of interesting to see. Same thing goes for Ohio State for kind of different reasons. I know they had some guys that were banged up in the game against Clemson, but really what we're focused on here, and you kind of been focused on all year if you're an Ohio State fan, is who is going to be announced as starting, as available, and as out about an hour or two before kickoff. Like which players are going to be able to go and which ones because of COVID-related reasons or contact tracing aren't able to go. And I know, a lot of focus, rightfully so, is on the interior, well, just really the defensive line. And there have been, rumors back and forth about who tested positive, who had a false positive. It's just impossible to know because there's only really a precious few people who do know. And in lieu of, Ryan Day texting me about this overnight, I'll probably find out with you guys on the morning of or the afternoon of the game. But I mean, it's important for obvious reasons, but the real thing I think about is Ohio State recruits so that they can have depth to withstand injuries or personnel losses of any kind. I don't think about that. I don't think that if we have a certain number of guys that are announced as being out tomorrow night, I won't think necessarily right off the bat, oh, that means they're going to lose. No, that's not it, man. Ohio State's plenty good enough. And so as long as Justin Fields' name's not on that list, they should be okay. Trey Sermon's not on that list, they should be okay. What I'm looking at is, all right, how vulnerable does that make you once this game starts to losing guys just for game-related reasons? You know, if a guy twists his ankle, if a guy catches a cramp, who is his backup? And if the guy who's on the field catching the cramp is already a backup, how many critical areas could you be down to a number 3 being on the field? Because Alabama is lethal at exposing that stuff. They're lethal at going after your starters to begin with. But if you've got an area of sustained vulnerability where you got a prolonged situation where one of their ones is against one of your 3s, that's going to be exposed. They will dissect it and go after it like an assassin, because that's exactly what they do. So immediately, when you hear those names announced, who's starting and who's not, you pull out your trusty Ohio State depth chart and you check out, all right, now how vulnerable are they? How thin is the layer of sand on top of this roster at this particular position group, and how deep do you have to dig before you would get into real trouble there? Just something to keep an eye on during the game. Which one of these offenses blinks early? Now, in this case, it could just mean which one of them doesn't score at least 3 on a drive. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something that I guess would be kind of unforeseen. If one of these offenses has a really early 3 and out, and then the next series looks shaky, you've gone 2 series in a row in a game that you figure to need to score pretty much every drive, or at least, be moving the ball every drive, and put yourself in a position to challenge, well, then you get a little unsure of yourself, and everyone else on the other sideline tastes blood in the water. It's really not even metaphorical. That's quite literally what they see from that press box, and that's what they see from the field level. So will there be one of these offenses that takes a little while longer to get it in gear? Is one of these defenses capable of giving maybe some unique looks, some unique pressure? Does something break down along an offensive line early? Do you have maybe a key injury early? Is there a guy you thought would start that doesn't start, that ends up providing a bigger vulnerability offensively for one of these units than previously thought? Just watch that early, because I'm not saying if you grab a 14-0 lead, this game's over, but obviously if that happens, then you force one of these teams into the very unfamiliar role of having to play catch-up. Think about that. When is the last time you watched Ohio State this year having to play catch-up a majority of a game? Early against Clemson they did, and they did a fine job of it, but otherwise, when's the last time you watched that this year? When's the last I know the answer to this. When's the last time you watched Alabama have to do that? They did it against Georgia one time. I think that's about it. And that was a situation where you were facing Stetson Bennett, and there was not exactly the overwhelming threat of the opposing team pulling away from you. So there was time. Ohio State trailed Northwestern, but they always knew once we yawn enough and get the sleep out of our eyes, we can fly past them. And you did. How about Ohio State's defensive line, Alabama's offensive line? I told you in our keys section, and I've talked about it all week, I think the single biggest matchup, the single most important matchup in this game is the Ohio State defensive line against the interior here, the interior of the Alabama O-line. When Landon Dickerson went down, their Remington award-winning center, when he went down against Florida, there were 2 reactions. Nationally, people who aren't die-hard Alabama fans, they probably watched that and said, oh, one of their 5 All-American caliber offensive linemen is down. Well, okay, they still got the rest of them. I'm sure it's Alabama. They recruit well. They've got good depth. They'll be fine. And that was the national perception. I can tell you right now that was not the perception in Tuscaloosa. They know, even as deep as you are, even as good as you recruit, there are certain pivot points, there are certain hinge points on your roster where, you can ill afford to lose a guy, maybe more so than other positions. And center is a position like that for them. Now, having said that, Chris Owens is a guy who feels like he's about 27 years old. He's been there forever, so he's got a lot of experience. He is a quality reserve. But if you're looking at a heat map and your best players are in green and your most vulnerable players are yellows or reds, that is an area of this heat map matchup where if I'm looking at ours, we do these sometimes, I have got a bunch of green touching a bunch of yellow. for Ohio State versus Alabama there. And what that is again, it's the interior of the Ohio State defensive line right up against an unproven center against high-level competition. Chris Owens is serviceable. He is not a Remington Award winner. And so all that does is it puts the possibility on the table of one of two things happening. Either Chris Owens has the game of his career and ends up, being a hero in Tuscaloosa for stepping in when he needed to and fueling a national championship win by keeping Mac Jones clean, or Ohio State is able to consistently disrupt from the interior. When you think about these games, when you think about affecting the quarterback, most of the time your head goes to edge rushers and pass rush from the edge. That's typically where the mind goes. That's not always the way it has to happen. And in a situation like this, it's even more fortuitous if you're Ohio State, knowing the strength of this Alabama offense and the need to move the launch point for Mac Jones in order to interrupt that. Well, you'd rather get pressure on the interior. You'd rather collapse that pocket from the interior. It doesn't matter if you got a bunch of Chase Youngs on the outside. You got those cats you have on the inside. If they're healthy and they're able to play, and you've got the vulnerability there that you think you may have, and that's a matchup advantage, go after it. Go after it all day. And here's the final question I have. When are the strides hit? So these games, sometimes they come out and it is immediate fireworks. Other times, it's kind of choppy early on. You have some early jitters, nerves, whatever you want to call them, teams feeling each other out. There are a lot of really good athletes on the field. Sometimes a funny thing happens when you just expect that a defense that maybe statistically isn't great but has a lot of great athletes on the field, when you think they're just going to get run over from bell one, sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes when you got really good players on the field, they tend to, push back a little bit. So when are the strides going to get hit in this game? Because there's going to eventually come a point, in fact, I'd be very surprised if this point didn't come, where there are going to be a lot of points being traded. Okay? Does that happen early? Is it 14-14 at the end of the first quarter, or is it 9-3 at the end of the first quarter and it's been kind of shaky, and then the team that's already up is in the red zone again, and obviously one stride's being hit but the other isn't? Do we have a game that starts like that, or do we have a game where it's just trading points the whole way? And when we do eventually get to that point, how deep in the game are we? How long does it take before we reach that point? Now, that's probably critical as much for a totals better as it is for, which team's going to win the game. Having said that, you don't want to get down 20-3 before you hit that stride. So those are some questions that I will be focused on. This is going to be a great game, man. It's going to be a really, really great game. There is a ton of pride in these programs. These are supreme alpha programs. Always, I'll take these matchups for 100 years. A lot of you claim that you want to see a Cinderella make this game. That's fine. I prefer the big dogs to make this game. I love watching this. I could watch this all day, twice on Sunday, 3 times on Monday. And as it turns out, that's when we're playing this game, Monday night.